Let's get started. My name's Matt Siegel. For those of you who I don't know, nice to virtually meet you. For those who I do know, it's great to see a lot of familiar faces. Um, I, as the chair of the Science Advisory Committee of the Cobb Institute, want to welcome all of you to this very exciting series of seminars and dialogues with Dr. Timothy Eastman. I'm going to say a few words about the Science Advisory Committee of the Cobb Institute, what our mission is, and I want to then give us an overview of what we'll be doing today and in our future sessions. And then I will introduce John Cobb Jr., who will say a few words, and then we'll turn it over to Timothy Eastman. So the Science Advisory Committee is just one small part of the Cobb Institute, which is focused on furthering the aspect of the Cobb Institute's mission that has to do with advancing a process approach to the natural sciences. And we have a great committee of scientists and philosophers. I myself am not a scientist. I am a philosopher committed to transdisciplinary work, which is very difficult, but luckily there's a great team of process influenced and Whitehead influenced scientists that are teaching me a lot. Tim is one of them. And we want to advance this aspect of the Cobb Institute's mission by holding events like this, for example. We've also got a plan for more interviews with scientists who have been directly or indirectly influenced by Whitehead or process thought. You saw that we have Rupert Sheldrake already, interview with him at the bottom of our page there, and there will be more coming. And so we're just trying to provide a source of connection, a network, a opportunity for dialogue among those who take a process approach to their work in the natural sciences. This is, I think, one of our first major events to advance that mission. But there has already been a long history of interdisciplinary and transdisciplinary work coming out of the Center for Process Studies, engaging with scientists, physicists, biologists, psychologists. And I'm going to invite John Cobb in a moment to say a little bit about that history. But first, let's just lay out what we're going to do today. After I introduce John Cobb, he'll speak for 5 or 10 minutes, and then I'll introduce Dr. Tim Eastman, who will speak for about 20 minutes to introduce his book, Untying the Gordian Knot. And he's going to focus on chapter 1 today. And then we've invited a few of the scholars that he draws upon in his work to participate as respondents. Mikhail Epstein and Jude Jones are both with us this morning, and I'll introduce them later. They will respond, and then we'll have a bit of dialogue among the three of them. And then the last hour or so today, we will open it up to questions from everybody else. Currently, your mics will be muted. We'll fix that later, and we will invite your questions. I want to encourage you to write your questions in the chat at any point during the dialogue. And then when the second hour rolls around, we will start calling on you based on those questions so that you can ask them yourself. And we'll continue this sort of a format moving forward. Every second Saturday, same time, Saturday mornings, 8 a.m. Pacific, 11 a.m. Eastern time. For 2 hours, and each session will include different respondents, and Tim will move through the chapters of his book. And our aim in the future, now that COVID is wrapping up, fingers crossed, at least for many places in the world, we would love to have an academic conference at some point next year to continue this work of bringing process thought to bear on the many disciplines in the natural sciences that need to be integrated and Dr. Eastman's book has really moved the ball forward on that account. So with that, let me introduce a man who needs really no introduction, but just in case some of you are new to the process community and to process thoughts, let me tell you a bit about John Cobb Jr., theologian, philosopher, environmentalist, author of too many books for me to count, more than 50. John is a very transdisciplinary thinker, and as co-founder of the Center for Process Studies has really been instrumental in introducing the world to Whitehead's thought, applying process philosophy to education, environmentalism, economics, the sciences, more recently developing this notion of ecological civilization in the midst of our ecological crisis. He studied at the University of Chicago with Charles Hartshorne. He established the Journal of Process Studies Journal with Lewis Ford in 1971, and more recently established the Cobb Institute in 2019, which has allowed us to gather here today. So with that, John, I will turn it over to you.
Okay. Am I visible and audible, or just visible, or just
Yes, you are on and coming through loud and clear. Thanks, Sean.
Okay. Well, I appreciate the opportunity. Those who think that Whitehead had made the greatest recent advances in understanding ourselves and our world are sad that so few scientists avail themselves of his achievements. One reason for creating the Center for Process Studies was to encourage a shift in science from substance to process thinking. The center was organized in 1973, and its first conference, held at Bellagio, Italy in 1974, was on Mind in Nature. Thanks to its organizer, Charles Birch, among the participants were a number of prestigious biologists: Theodosius Dobzhansky, C.H. Waddington, Sewell Wright, and W.H. Thorpe. At that time, senior figures like these were interested in Whitehead. However, universities had already compartmentalized, so few scientists of the next generation continued that interest. Fortunately, there were exceptions. Waddington brought with him to the conference a young quantum physicist, David Bohm, with whom we worked for years. The center was fortunate to have David Griffin as its conference organizer. Over the next 2 decades, he organized perhaps a dozen conferences on the natural sciences, finding the most thoughtful and open-minded participants. I hope that someday the importance of David's work will be appreciated. Because most of our conference participants knew little about Whitehead, David typically wrote a paper in advance explaining how Whitehead viewed the issues to be discussed. Usually these essays were very helpful. On one occasion, he wrote far too much. No one read his paper, and the discussion suffered. However, he expanded it somewhat, and it was published by the University of California Press in 1998 as Unsnarling the World Knot. A comparison with Untying the Gordian Knot might prove interesting. There was a burst of concern when physicists at Caltech declared that Whitehead's theory of relativity had been refuted. Despite Einstein's predictive success, some, including Whitehead, thought that his formula did not make sense. The differences in prediction among the alternative proposals was slight, but all but Whitehead's had failed the legitimate tests. Whitehead's formula implied that distant galaxies had some gravitational effect. When more and more precise measures showed no influence, Whitehead's theory was declared refuted. Did that mean that we needed to reject his cosmology? Whitehead had written a book on relativity theory, which no one claimed to understand. We met over several years to unpack his theory. His cosmological concern was that Einstein's talk of the distortions of space reified it in a way that he could not accept. Most of his book was proposing a radically different theory with very slightly differing predictions. However, the book considered the possibility that the evidence might conform to Einstein's formula rather than to his. He offered another formula that gave exactly the same predictions as Einstein, without assuming the variable curvature of space. Einstein's success did not require us to accept his metaphysics. At that time, we were hardly aware that a young specialist in empty space was interested in Whitehead. His name was Tim Eastman. Whitehead understood that empty space is space in which there is no mass. Tim Eastman has taught me that it is full of plasma, a type of reality still largely ignored by many scientists. Whitehead's work on relativity played a large role in the development of his thought, but this has been largely ignored. On the other hand, he wrote very little about quantum theory, but a good many quantum theorists have recognized his relevance. Tim has spent many years studying this new physics, and he is one who has appreciated Whitehead's cosmological contribution. He has now published a book that summarizes and creatively develops the achievements of two generations of theorists. It is written in the language of the scientists on whose work he builds. Whiteheadian terminology is rare, but I suspect that Whitehead would admire this proposed cosmology based on the new science more than the writings of those of us who have promoted his theories in his language. That the new theory articulated and developed in this book is so congruent with Whitehead's cosmology would delight him as it delights those of us who have trusted Whitehead's essential adequacy. I believe that more and more people are now realizing that for all its achievements, modern thought, including modern scientific thought, belongs to the past. That realization opens the door to new thinking, such as Eastman's in this book. If this book is widely read, there is a chance that it will be the occasion for a profound breakthrough of process thought. Let's make that happen.
Thanks so much, John, for that history and the larger context and the importance of Dr. Eastman's book. Let me now introduce Tim Eastman, who, as you mentioned, John, is a space plasma physicist turned process philosopher. Dr. Eastman was a researcher of space plasmas and space physics for over 25 years, including time as the national coordinator for basic research at the National Science Foundation at NASA. And there, with this research, he made important discoveries related to Earth's magnetosphere, the Earth's relationship to the sun. He has a longstanding interest in process thought, as we heard from John. He was guest editor of the Process Studies Journal in 1997 and 1998, where he helped to edit 2 issues related to the sciences. I was just looking at those issues this morning. Wanted to direct your attention to those, also to a book that Tim Eastman edited, 2003. This came out edited with Hank Keaton, Physics and Whitehead, Quantum Process and Experience, great collection of essays and dialogues here. And then, of course, Untying the Gordian Knot, Process, Reality, and Context, which we have gathered to learn about. It will take us 8 months to deepen into, to just really begin, I think, to scratch the surface of all the different disciplines that Dr. Eastman has brought to bear on this question of really nothing less than, what is the ultimate nature of reality? And he's drawing on the sciences, of course, but also the humanities and spirituality, as we'll see. He's trying to rethink the nature of reality along lines that, as John Cobb mentioned, Whitehead would have been thrilled about. Dr. Eastman will be talking about the role of potentia or potentiality in the natural world, the importance of context, information theory and the relationship of information to meaning, causality, emergence, and so much more. So with no further ado, I want to turn it over to Dr. Timothy Eastman to lead us into this very important book. The floor is yours, Tim.
Well, thank you, Matt. Such a gracious introduction, and by both of you and by Professor Cobb, who I've so long admired as a leader of this process movement throughout the past several decades. And just yesterday, I pulled off my shelf a book that illustrates the importance of this prophet among us. Almost 50 years ago, John published this book, Is It Too Late? Of which the 50th anniversary would be in this coming year. So talk about a prophet and about the global current issues about global change that are among us right now. And along with that, I believe David Griffin himself might be logging in as well with our group. Greetings to David. And mind you, along with just simply referring to John Cobb and David and others by simply the first name, whatever, and let's, for now, among us colleagues here, we'll drop the Dr. Whatever stuff. And because we're among a group of scholars and also interested lay people to jointly together try to struggle and wrap our arms around these issues. So again, I want to thank the conveners of this gathering, to Matt Siegel of the California Institute of Integral Studies and the Cobb Institute, John Cobb himself and the Cobb Institute with Richard Livingston and others who have done so much to really get going with a lot of issues in ecological civilization, et cetera. I encourage anyone and everyone who's online to check out the Cobb Institute and its current activities and to get involved in some way, perhaps. Also, I just wish to thank my supporters over the years, friends and family, that context of support that everyone depends on, the various colleagues and scholars over the years. For example, I've utilized to great benefit the resources of the Library of Congress, for which my work very much benefited, being able to have quick access to essentially any publication worldwide, right to scholars' desks that I had there for a while. And my thanks to the Fetzer Institute for some support at one brief time. But a Fetzer Institute support for an activity that led to some of the key work that I'm developing or building on. And there's just a large array of people that I depend on for even getting to where I'm at on this project. And especially I want to thank my loving wife, who's right here, Carolyn Brown.
Hello.
Yeah. And so she's been especially critical in this. And she's not just my wonderful supporting wife, but also an important, notable scholar on her own. Besides having been, before her retirement, the director of the Scholars Center at the Library of Congress, which I like to say at one point, she was formerly in the organization chart, the boss of the Poet Laureate of the United States. So anyway, but then among other things, she just recently, a little over a year ago, published a book, Reading Lu Xun through Carl Jung. This is in Chinese literature, but it addresses issues, for example, of scapegoating. And I'll be getting into eventually how issues of context, of history, and so to speak, the complementary denials of context, denials of history, scapegoating is part of what leads us into some of the current problems that we are wrestling with in the current political and other kinds of landscape. So what I'll be talking about in terms of the science-humanities connection is relevant for all kinds of issues. And in one's, say, involvement in fundamental experience, from the very earliest times, that you're always involved with, say, how to handle that experience, how to take in those inputs. From the very earliest times, our mental apparatus, our visual system, our neurological system is learning how to adapt to handle that as we grow to eventually be able to order those inputs in some manner that enables us to set up certain models for how to handle catching that ball, how to handle or handling your fingers in a way to be able to control tying one's shoelace, as my grandmother had taught me to do. And the model making associated with that every biological creature is involved with a certain type of modeling the world, and that negotiation between the world and the inputs and the model is part of how creatures manage the introduction of new inputs. So this is all part, as Robert Rosen has described in some detail in Anticipatory Systems, the nature of complex systems, complex biological systems. And in that, there's always the issue of not just the input, output, but also the context for such creaturely response. And that there's the issue of what is the nature, ultimate nature of things in the world. It's easy to sort of focus on their particular beingness, their particular substance, character, our worldview, perceptual objects, that especially is emphasized by our vision being a dominant component of our overall sensory set of senses, that are with our vision dominance, we tend to think, well, the worldview is that the nature of things is much like our worldview of perceptual objects. We have these discrete things we see in our vision, the pen here, the desk, and the book over there, and they're all isolatable in my mind, and therefore they are distinct by virtue of that mental isolation. And therefore, as David Hume in the late 18th century argued, they somehow ultimately are separable. They ultimately are substance things that are ultimately separable. But in contrast to that, what we have discovered in the last 150 years of the development of field theory since the time of Maxwell in the 1850s and 60s and the work with electrodynamics, and the follow-on discoveries based upon field theory throughout the 20th century in physics has led us to realize that it's not just simply discrete substances and isolatable atoms, that we have both the things and their interactions, that indeed some then lead to the hypothesis that the things, the substances literally are constituted by the fields and those interactions. from my book, let me just read a passage that I found most insightful about expressing this by Elizabeth Krauss, who is the professor at Fordham University, whose mantle has been now passed on to Jude Jones, who is with us and will be giving a response later. Let me quote from Elizabeth's excellent book, The Metaphysics of Experience, published in 1998. Quote, being and becoming, permanence and change must claim co-equal footing in any metaphysical interpretation of the real, because both are equally insistent aspects of experience, both being and becoming. So this, so to speak, to me, it's like the combination of the fields and the particles. It's both of them. And then what I was led to in my research, looking over a whole range of disciplines, but especially in the physics, is realizing that we have to attend to both actuality and possibility, that just focusing on, so to speak, the discrete substances and the very beingness of things can lead us into somehow assuming or presuppose that the actualities are the ultimate real and that everything else is somewhat along for the ride. But in contrast to that, I would argue that it's both. We have ultimately a logic of actuality and a logic of possibility, potentiality. And in combination with that, I've already mentioned about the input-output context triadic. It's not just the dyad of input-output, but always there's a third, a reference to a third. We call this semiotics when there's such a reference to a third. And this triadic aspect is fundamental. It's fundamental in the logic and in the mathematics and the physics, and we'll come back to that. Another thing I found very useful was to think in terms of, in science, we spend a lot of effort trying to isolate the parameters so as to find what are the parameters that and their associated quantitative relationship that are independent of context, independent of whether you happen to be on planet Earth or planet Mars or in another galaxy. And we're able, by human imagination, to infer such and then test them. And that led us to, say, Newton's laws that we find to a very good approximation apply whether we're here in planet Earth or Mars or wherever, as examples of that. So science focuses on the goal of context independence, the way of numbers, one might say. And symmetry is a representation, a way of expressing that independence of particular location, particular time. So science is a way of knowing that emphasizes the goal of context independence. Mind you, of course, in any particular application, you have to introduce initial conditions and boundary conditions. And so it's not, the application always has context in some way. The working with and development and participation in the scientific enterprise always involves context. In fact, you're so much dependent on looking at how to minimize the context. So it's all wrapped up in any functional approach to any discipline whatsoever. However, its goal is to identify those basic relationships, ultimately the physical laws, quote unquote, that are themselves in some way, in approximation, context independent. So that's one way of knowing. And I would argue that a second way of knowing necessarily is a way of knowing that emphasizes context, that emphasizes the reference to the third, the input-output context, that triadic. Ultimately, well, it's called semiotics, this the inevitable linkage to a sign that points to a third. And this brings us into arts and humanities and their importance. Well, this will be brought out in some comments, I'm sure, by Professor Mikhail Epstein, who we're very glad to have with us, who will be introduced shortly for his comments. So that's a second way of knowing ultimately. First, we had context independence as a goal. Secondly, context emphasis as a way of knowing, respectively the way of numbers, then the way of signs. And I would argue that we inevitably have a third way of knowing, that is context in some ultimate manner, ultimate context, which then points to the spiritual dimension, yet not necessarily with any particular God's eye view. So the fundamental notions, then I thought, well, is there some way that one can get at the fundamental notions that really, in a very deep philosophical way, that can cut through these various issues in a way that is presupposed in our scientific work, as well as say everyday life. And working with this, I finally came to realize that one could do this, and one didn't have to make direct reference to space and time as such, that there were fundamental notions, including extensiveness, philosophically understood, that is prior to the more, say, commonsensical notions of marking out time and marking out spatial relation. So I'm getting to the fundamental notions I came to, and I bring this out on page 105, for example, of the book, as well as in the second chapter, of process. That is input, output, succession without context, or within context. Always constraints and potential involved. But so process is one. And then logic is a second. A logic of actualizations, which is being a two-valued, what's called a Boolean logic. Anyway, a dyadic, two-valued logic, yes or no, on or off. Our computers work with dyadic logic, digital logic. It's fundamental to computers. But also a logic of potential relations. That is a logic of what I call potentia, multi-valued logic, or non-Boolean logic. So we have the Boolean and the non-Boolean, the logic of the actuals, the logic of possibility. And then, in addition to process and logic, I argue that we fundamentally have relations as a third fundamental notion, constituted of process, part-whole relations, local-global relations, internal-external, including relations of relations, that is semiotics, extension, and relations in category theory. Category theory being a new mathematical apparatus developed since the 1940s that provides a fundamental algebra of relations. So I know these terms are getting a little complex, and if you haven't been exposed to it here yet, don't worry about the details. Just remember that I'm just identifying some fundamental notions that are prior to certain later notions. That process, logic, and relations can be, and extension, can be argued to be fundamental notions, fundamental even metaphysical notions that are such that even time and space in the conventional sense are derivative or emerge out of these more fundamental notions. And then I came into all of this, my quest that I attempted to work out that this is all grounded in experience in some way, whether it be in more controlled experience of a scientist working in a laboratory or by normal human experience, that inferring these notions, it's not some ad hoc inference by virtue of some abstraction, some abstract theory, but really grounded in, say, characterization, careful characterizations of human experience even in the broad sense of whatever creature. And quoting from page 5 of my book here, that I propose that the most fundamental notions can be inferred from normal human experience, that concepts of contemporary science and philosophy can be woven together in a way that cuts through claims of quantum weirdness, that these concepts reveal a deeper reality that comports well with basic human experience and intuition, and that they move us from a very particular human quest and journey to a promising new synthesis, natural, existential, spiritual even. Then, and I work out the details of that throughout my work, and my methodology is that of, say, problem, solution, goals. And the Gordian knot is a reference to a set of problems for which I'm trying to apply this methodology to in a systematic way. And I first lay these out on page 66 of the work. the sequence of the Gordian knot of problems. Well, for a while, I thought I would just call my book Process, Context, and Reality. And Carolyn got after me and said, oh, untying the Gordian knot is such that's catchy, that'll catch people. You know, process, context, and relations, that's a whole hum, you know, it'll never, whatever. Anyway, this is not going to be a bookseller by any cut of the imagination, and whatever publications I've had in my whole life, I've never made a penny from. so that's the way it is. Anyway, in the Gordian knot of problems, I lay out a baker's dozen, 13 classic philosophic problems that I came to realize gradually over the last decade that there are possible new approaches to these problems, maybe even solutions, but perhaps at least a route to solution for each of these. Problems of one, measurement, potentiality, continuity, temporality, causal relations, the notion of physical law, emergence, information and knowledge, induction, access to abstract concepts, matter symbol problem, mind-body problem, the problem of meaning. Indeed, by getting at these fundamental notions, combining them with some new results in quantum physics, which I'll come to shortly, and pulling this together in taking advantage of some developments in philosophy in the last few decades, give a new possibility for pulling this together in a way that really can cut through this Gordian knot, at least be an inspiration for a new approach. May I ask, so how much more time do I have, Matt?
I would say if 5 more minutes would be, is that doable?
Okay, that's fine.
Okay.
Thank you very much. So what I have, so you'll see on the Gordian knot I have developed in chapters 2 and 3, but there's a lot of cross-cutting concepts that are relevant to this. That what I do is in the sequence of chapters, basically I focus on the relevant cross-cutting concepts. In chapter, so chapter 2, relations, and relations of relations. I use the term logoi to, based upon the Greek word, to then make reference to that. And chapter 3, then I talk about going from Gordian knot to the logoi framework, which and a framework that's built upon a model of relational realism and possibilism that comes out of contemporary interpretations in quantum physics that will be developed in chapter 2 that we'll see in the next session and by principal participants in that. Ruth Kastner of the University of Maryland, who's worked with a excellent new possibilist interpretation of quantum physics, and Michael Epstein and Ilias Zafiris of the California State University in Sacramento and the University of Athens, Greece. They have pulled together new approaches that have a lot of lot of promise for newly understanding the fundamental natures of the quantum question. And then in chapter 4, I get to, given that, a new approach to causation, emergence, and complex systems in chapter 4. In chapter 5, I then bring it to bear on the issues of information and semiotics, semiotics now being the way of signs. And then chapter 6, the complex whole. And in chapter 7, referring back to a great American philosopher, Charles Sanders Peirce, Peirce's triads and Whitehead's process, fundamental triads and schemas associated with them. And then in chapter 8, finally, I get to the issue of contextuality from experience to meaning and struggling with the issue of meaning. And so let me, there's one passage that is useful for pulling this together. So as I get to the final chapter, I provide reflections on the overall quest and focus on the questions of ultimate context and meaning. And I argue then for the immense value of scholarly research in a wide variety of fields that could contribute to enhance human self-awareness, other awareness, and deeper understandings of reality. It connects the new scientific results to such humanistic scholarship, yet again expanding the human context historically, humanistically, and spiritually. These recent developments clearly indicate the need for updated worldviews that can avoid the nihilism of mechanistic materialism and simplistic reductionism, and that can open up space for new perspectives on human meaning and the spiritual dimension. Taken together, such research, of which what I'm doing is just a small part, has a potential to overcome the tendency toward false dualisms, false isms, made-up facts, scapegoating, racism, and the resulting strife and wars, all being largely preventable illnesses of the human condition. At a time of reduced support for the humanities, as a scientist, I concur with Mikhail Epstein's very persuasive argument in his work, The Transformative Humanities, that you'll no doubt refer to, about the singular importance of humanistic discourse in enabling the transformative work that is so critically needed. So with that, I think I can do follow-up to Q&A, and that might help elaborate some of the others. I had another 10 minutes of comments, but we don't need to. Everybody has the book to access and go to, and can raise their questions as you will. So thank you very much.
Thanks so much, Tim. I am now going to introduce the first of our two respondents, Mikhail Epstein, who's professor of Russian and cultural theory, as well as the director of the Center for Humanities Innovation at Durham University in the UK, as well as Samuel Candler Dubbs Professor of Cultural Theory and Russian Literature at Emory University in Atlanta, where he will be speaking to us from today. Mikhail has published 40 books, hundreds of articles that brings an interdisciplinary approach to the humanities. And he's going to speak to this issue of context in the humanities and the relationship of humanities to the sciences and other aspects. So we're so grateful, Mikhail, that you have joined us, and the floor is yours. Please.
Thank you very much. I'm enormously grateful to Tim for inviting me to participate in this session, and of course for his wonderful book that is inspiring and inspirational for, I would say, all minds engaged in various disciplines, including the humanities, because it offers the way to build what is sometimes called the theory of everything, not abstract, but dynamic theory based on real knowledge and creative thinking in various disciplines. Of course, I will focus on the humanities and how the book, Tim's book, can provide us with a framework of possibilistic thinking that is peculiar to the humanities. The point is that, as the book emphasizes on many occasions, that fundamental, I'm citing, fundamental quantum process always involves a transition from potential relations, potential, to actuality, with an associated range of possible outcomes. So this is how quantum world brings the potentiality and its actualization into the physical world. As we are talking about the humanities, I would say the process is the reverse, but based on the same relationship between actuality and potency. The humanities potentialize. It's a kind of counterpart to actualization, something called potentialization. There is an actual object like this pen, and when we start thinking about it, we place it a number, infinite number of contexts. And here I, of course, refer to one of the principal concept of the Gordian knot, contextualization and context. I can look at this pen in narrow spatial context, in the context of the house, of the furniture, in the context of philosophy, psychology, psychology of creativity when I'm using this pen, psychology of writing, scriptorics. I can think about any actual objects in the context of world and psychology and my own biography, when I use these pens, when I stopped using pens and went to computer. And this is actually the process of possibilization. The actual object that we have in the physical world is potentialized and possibilized by our thinking. And this, what makes humanities, the humanities. Aristotle, and here I cite from Aristotle, the potency is prior to the actual cause, and it is not necessary for everything potential to be actual. That which has a potency need not exercise it, unquote. That means that potencies or possibilities have their own ontological value. They are part of great chain of being. And we know it as human beings. We know it through our emotional experience. What is fear, for example, as our attitude to the possibility of pain or death. What is hope, but our relationship to the possibility of joy and luck. Actually, the strongest human emotions, not only thinking, as I mentioned before, but emotional life, emotional experience is based on our attitude to the potentialities, to potential events. What would be our faith if not it is a threat to something potential? And we know also that history, as studied in the humanities, is not just what happened. Referring to one very important English historian, Hugh Trevor Roper, I will cite him. History is not merely what happened, it is what happened in the context of what might have happened. Therefore, it must incorporate as a necessary element the alternatives, the might have beens. History is full of alternative histories, and we also experience them as thinking entities by trying to impart certain meaning to a historical event. What would be the meaning of a certain event, for example, October Revolution in Russia 1917, unless there were different alternatives to this event? We could describe the event only in terms of its alternatives, of its possible alternatives. And in the course of history, these alternatives accumulate with each historical event. That's why Arnold Toynbee wrote about what he called etherization of history. That means the history more and more incorporates the possibilities that were not actualized, not realized, but give meaning to those events that were actualized in history. So we have multiplying branches of possible alternative histories, which actually account for the meaning of history as we have it. And this is what the humanities are about, delving into the world of these possibilities, historical, biographical, emotional, intellectual possibilities, in order to give meaning to every single actuality of this world. And the humanities not just investigate these meaningful possibilities of meaning itself, but they actualize this possibility in their own turn. The entire world of culture is actually actualization of those possibilities, potentialities that went through human consciousness. We perceive and refract the actual world through our consciousness, create potential objects. This is mental event, and then we transform this mental event into actual events of our culture. Culture is the world of possibilities actualized. And this process is actually infinite, beginning from quantum process, actualization of potential on quantum level, on the level of quantum events, then the macro world as we see it, as perceive it, the world of actual objects, then the process of thinking, which potentializes the world of actualities, then the process of new actualization, creating culture and its values. This is an incessant process that opens the perspective, the perspective described in the Gordian notes as spirituality, as potentiality beyond maybe actualization, as potentiality of the potentiator of some ultimates, again, using the concept that Tim gives such an importance in his book, the ultimate potentiator of the world, making the world happening. And of course, we have some middle link between quantum world and world of consciousness as designated in the theory of Penrose and Hameroff, which is also a point of reference in the book Quantum Vibrations in Macrotubules Inside Brain Neurons, as an explanation of the process of consciousness. Thus, the largest framework offered in this book presupposes interaction, at least of physics, neurobiology, neuroscience, and the humanities. And I think this is where the book invites collaboration of various disciplines, and I will be happy to participate in it from the humanistic side. And thank you again, Tim, for really inspiring introduction to the theory of everything. Thank you.
Thanks, Mikhail, for that really rich contribution, pointing out the ways in which this new framework allows us to integrate nature and culture in a new way, and the role of potentiality in history is quite profound. So hope we can return to that during our dialogue. Next, I want to introduce Jude Jones, who is a professor in the philosophy department at Fordham University in New York. Her work is well known among process thinkers, in particular, one of my favorite books on Whitehead, Intensity, which was somehow able to both maintain a sense of metaphysical rigor, as well as to also convey the meaning of Whitehead's metaphysics in a lyrical and poetic way. She's a scholar of American philosophy as well, with interests in ethics and agency, how we understand individuality, attention, axiology, and more. Jude, I turn the floor over to you, hand you the mic, and look forward to your contribution.
Thank you so much for that really kind introduction, Matt. I'm really, really delighted to be part of this set of conversations, this initiation of the series. I'm really grateful that Tim invited me to be reflective about this really exciting monograph. I'm going to mostly read these comments to just keep myself from droning on forever. They may be a little bit too long as it is, but it'll help rein me in. So rather than focus on any of the scientific aspects that I'm particularly ill-equipped to be particularly insightful about, I want to seize on some of the metaphors and raise questions about how they serve as signposts in this quest. And I'm going to do this for things that are quotes from the book or other things. this quest that's introduced in this first chapter. He begins by talking about his 13-year-old self, right? Recognizing his radical finiteness and humility before an infinite cosmos. As the woodland air filled his nostrils and the vistas of the Dakota hills rose in the distance beyond the lakeside where he stood. And I couldn't help but immediately think of Wordsworth's description in the prelude of those spots of time, as he calls them, that, as the prelude continues, with distinct preeminence retain a renovating virtue. That seems to be an ability to remake us later, to restart the adventure with openness to fresh or ancient insight that's been forgotten or neutralized by confusion or by suffering or by habit that's become insufferable. Some have interpreted that dynamic of spots of time in Wordsworth as part of the semiosis of the self, which makes it resonate nicely with what Tim's about, the constant provision of a third in any present artificially two-dimensional subject-object encounter. This moment, this third, is marked in the book we're talking about today as the always reinvigorating beginning of Tim's quest that transforms from a youthful, problematic ambition for a divine God's eye view to a proto-divinatory logoi method that wants to challenge the very vision through which it's occurring, as it's occurring, by privileging anticipation over retrospectiveness in the projects of understanding. So my first sort of selfish wish is to invite Tim, if you can, to unpack more of that spot of time, to share that deep experiential impact that informs that crucial openness to experiential impacts per se, right, that the logoi method is trying to embrace. How does it found the semiosis of this quest? If Tim would like to talk about that at some point. But next I want to raise some provocations about the quest, and particularly the Gordian knot motif. And this will resonate with some things that Mikhail said about possibilizing. Tim describes wanting to cut through or unravel the Gordian knots that are these intractable problems about comprehensive and experientially understanding. And which is important, right? Because our time is really powerfully vibrating with a need for better insight and vision. What we meet in chapter 1 doesn't strike me as a strict reflection of the Alexandrian myth, really, of violently subverting the challenge of the knot by cleaving it, if that happened, or even the more likely solving of the riddle by the cleverness, right, of someone who studied with Aristotle, right? So I meditated a little on this founding metaphor of the book, its sort of internal spot of time, if you will, and looked for some help from another favorite poet, Zbigniew Herbert, who's famous for his Mr. Cogito collection, which I love and I think is appropriate to the challenges Tim lays out, where it's exploring the perplexity of being a human consciousness that's simultaneously impressed with its own exceptionalness and subdued all the time by the ways that the world overwhelms it. But for today, I looked at an essay of his, what he calls one of his apocryphal essays that are sort of playfully inaccurate or retellings of things. This is specifically one on the Gordian knot. And in his embellished and critical retelling, Alexander's cutting of the knot on the wagon that would legitimize rule is described in this way. This is a quote. Inconceivable blindness caused him to introduce an element of force into the process of thinking. How could he overlook the fact that the untying of knots and problems is not an athletic display, but an intellectual process? And this assumes trial and error, helplessness in the face of the tangled material of the world, wonderful human uncertainty, and humble patience. So my main question for today is about this humble respect for the tangled material of the world. Herbert says that Alexander's cleaving was a murder of the mystery, right? The mystery was murdered, he says. And that makes me, again, sort of echo Wordsworth from The Tables Turned, the poem that Whitehead quotes too. Sweet is the lore which nature brings, our meddling intellect misshapes the beauteous forms of things we murder to dissect. Enough of science and of art, close up those barren leaves, come forth and bring with you a heart that watches and receives. And Elizabeth Krauss quotes that poem in her book as well. So I'm delighted she was mentioned. So I want to find out more about the Logoi method of the heart that watches and receives, that element of it, that respects the beauty of the knot and its ancient pattern that, if left whole, continues to inspire watching and receiving, right? So given that Tim accepts the idea that our models are at base our models and not the unraveling of the threads of nature itself, I wonder if it might be productive to describe the encounter with the knot in this way. Tim talks about cutting through or untying, in accordance with the myth of the Gordian knot, as resolving problems or framing solutions to a problem. And I worry that this framing makes the quest party to the prophecy that promised preeminence to whoever succeeded in wresting the knot's secret from it. To the resolver or solver, the knot appears as an artificially isolated one that's sort of dangling from a wagon. And even an assemblage or plurality of knots to unravel appear in that kind of a quest as discrete points of resistance in this metaphorical landscape. But maybe we should see the knots as answers in themselves in some way, reservoirs of mystery that should govern and subdue the human that is all too ready to assume and control mastery. And that, you know, Tim wants the Logoi method to help us with that sort of terrible tendency that's led to the ecological and social crises we're living through. So how do we respect the meaningfulness of the mystery of the knot, its capacity to possibilize things, as Mikhail put it earlier, even as we avoid what Tim acknowledges as a nihilism or an obscurantism by embracing the passions of wonder and sympathetic understanding that the humanities have arisen from? So how do we live the rationalistic and humanistic impulse to understand and be creative while not murdering the mystery, since the mystery is the ground of the possibilization rather than actuality? And the image that arose in my mind after reading the first chapter was not the unraveling of knots or cleaving of it, but the delighted creation of more knots to diffuse that perplexing outlier look of Gordian knots. The way Celtic or Viking knot patterns that have so much in common with one another and in common with Roman knot design from which they may have been derived, in its very repetition across objects, places, and times in human history and humanistic art and symbolization, it creates repetition through its repetition as a pattern rather than obscuring it. It creates meaning and intelligibility rather than obscurity. The proliferation of the knot is a medium of knowing rather than consternation, of meaning rather than nihilism. So maybe the Logoi method is best understood as an instance of what William James described as meeting the universe halfway, insofar as we participate in it partially in the mode of knowing there are unknowables, or at least unknowns that we productively help reinscribe in the adventure to keep it going in that humility and receptivity. It seems like one of the vital elements of the Logoi method is its capacity to build on creative tension that arises from this halfway encounter with things that are technically and maybe materially unresolvable. And this creative tension of the unresolved is part of the natural engine of anticipatory possibilizing and intelligibilizing of existence. So should we resist metaphors that guide Tim's and our quest that suggest smoothing out mystery and instead picture ourselves maybe meeting a knotted cosmos halfway and building with it? Tim has this beautiful line, recursively and dynamically generating from hypothetical notions a next order set of basic concepts. And I find it really productive to think of this as iteration and production of more knots that express our participation in a fecund natural environment. I have some other things. I don't want to go on much longer. That I think this also brings in the sort of rejection of a certain of the traditions of necessity that Tim quotes Randy Auxier laying out for us, a kind of unholy trinity, as a different trinity is embraced, the trinity of coherence, consistency, and applicability, right? The challenge with that holy trinity in rejecting the unholy trinity of logical, psychological, and ontological necessity is that the comprehensiveness sought, the consistency sought, can risk reinscribing some of the very habits that have left us with some of the really problematic knots at the social level, colonization, conquest, power, control. So as Tim embraces the idea of the human as an intensification of what's always been going on in the universe, I wonder if, like a Celtic knot, it could be seen as a pattern with no end or beginning, an opportunity to find in ourselves those aspects that nature's created in us, but that we've neglected as we undergo this self-assured conduct of intellect. Tim's vision strikes me as self-consciously not reductive naturalism of neurons and electrons, but a creative naturalism, where the very fabric of intelligence is trying to revise itself in light of things previously unnoticed in nature. And so it sort of needs to keep the knot alive as a source of inspiration. And part of this is sparked by recent encounter and puzzling over Levi Bruhl's description of the sense of magic in allegedly pre-scientific cultures as the intuition or capacity to be with the cosmos rather than understand it. And Levi Bruhl describes this as participation. And I'm wondering if the sense of magic, that youthful wonder Tim shared with us, is the energy of the quest in the first place. That sense of magic possibilizes the very quest itself and is a source, primordial source, I think, for that anticipatory living and explaining that Tim is describing being human as being about. And so maybe the Logoi method is decisively much more like art than physics, or an opportunity to see physics and everything else as what's best in art. So I look forward to thinking and hearing more about this inspiring work of art as I see it that Tim has delivered for our community. Thanks so much for your attention. Appreciate it.
Thank you, Jude, for reminding us of the importance of metaphor in metaphysics. It's through analogies that we connect things in the universe to one another and to ourselves. And I think you've beautifully illustrated that by playing on the knot metaphor. So at this point, we've got about 45 minutes left. I want to give Tim a chance to respond to what has been shared by Mikhail and Jude. And then Mikhail or Jude, if you have any follow-up, we can do that. And then there are a number of great questions in the chat already that I hope we can get to. But Tim, do you want to reflect on what has been said so far?
Well, both of these have been wonderful reflections and really something to ponder and think more thoroughly. Mikhail's wonderful reference to the humanities being a seedbed, a rich resource for just a generation of possibilities and working with those in productive ways to go beyond our limitations, the radical finiteness of our givenness, and to then, in an anticipatory system that we are, to then enable new directions, new ways of thinking that can get us outside of our current ruts. And Jude, you call attention to my childhood experience on the lakeshore in Big Stone County, looking across to the Dakota Hills. And yes, that cuts to the chase for sure. I bookend that beginning in chapter 1 with a reference back to it in chapter 8, where I then come back to the way in which there is a fundamental connectivity that goes beyond the order of actualization, the order of simply the discrete atoms, the discrete givenness, the discrete substances of conventional scientific work, which often simply assumes actualism, that the real is nothing but the actual. And I'm arguing that to take contemporary quantum physics seriously, insofar as at its core, there is a that, as Epstein Zafir stated, the electron is always observed as actualized in either one state or another in satisfaction of the principle of non-contradiction, and never observed as potentialized. That is, as a superposition of potential states in violation of the principle of non-contradiction. In this way, superpositions are properly understood as relations of successive actual states, initial and final. But what's key here is that in quantum physics, that it describes an evolution of a pure state of potential outcome states, potentia of possibilities, that are not mutually exclusive and can violate the principle of non-contradiction, to evolving then to a mixed state of probable outcome states that are mutually exclusive, satisfying the principle of non-contradiction, and exhaustive, that is, have to sum up to, that unity have to be one of at least one outcome state or other, and then to the actualization. So there's this succession built right into the very core of quantum physics of potentia to probability to actualization. And I'm working with then I'm making the philosophic inference from that basic physics to that there is a fundamental logic, and there's logic arguments for this that I've learned from George Shields and others in fundamental logic, that there's a logic basis, fundamental logic basis for the distinction of the order of non-Boolean logic versus the Boolean logic, the order of the potentia versus the order of actualization. And if that's truly fundamental, in other words, they're distinct yet interrelated. That fundamental reality is at all levels, from the quantum level of a quantum interaction to galactic scale, that we are embedded in a reality that is both of these aspects of the order of potentia, or order of actualization. And there I am as this 13-year-old, just embedded in feeling the grass and feeling what's embedded right there, and through my senses then, receiving a bunch of particular input outputs, right? And then there's this context, but at the same time, I'm coextensive with this possibility. And the realization was at the time that I transcended the mere givenness of that order of actualization, and then tapped into the order of potentia and realized that there is, so to speak, something that went beyond simply the push and shoves of there was something more. And I intuited that deeply. It was a spiritual experience. Mm. And the ground for meaning, I think, is at multiple levels of recognizing input-output context at multiple levels, and the tapping into this domain of potentia, that this coextensive logic of potential relations of potentia that is coextensive with our Boolean logic of the sets of actualizations whose output and correlations are the essence of our modern science, that the science and the realm of potentia are correlated always, right? But it's never reducible to nothing but the scientific description that is context independent. That's a myth. Scientism is a myth. That the reality is more wholesome and full, and the reality is more like what Jude points out as being the not in its fullness, discreteness to the connectedness, the part to the whole, that you have both. And to have only a part of that is to be imposing an approximation, to be cutting away at the knot. So yes, you need to do both. You need to be cutting at the knots in order to identify particular ways for a solution of this or that particular focus problem. But at the same time, there's a way in which the whole in part-whole relations is inevitably needed that interrelatedness is needed, and it's part of reality by virtue of always a certain linkage to the non-Boolean realm of potentia that is coextensive and always there in combination with the Boolean logical realm of actualization. And we're in a world whose reality is of that type of fullness that is also semiotic, that contemporary biosemiotics reflects this. So that's my complicated answer to a very insightful question.
Thank you, Tim. So unless Mikhail or Jude, did either of you want to chime in at this point, or should we turn
I would like to add something to what Tim said regarding the order of potentia. I think that what this book invites us to do in philosophy is to establish the third and triadic structures are also important, going beyond the Boolean logic. There is ontology and epistemology as the principal philosophical disciplines, the disciplines about to be and the discipline about know. But there is the third, the possibility for the third discipline, which I would call potentiology, which studies can, and can is irreducible to be or to know. It is the third element which goes beyond this dyadic logic. And we have many approximations to this discipline, potentiology, that studies potentiosphere, the sphere of the order of potentia, such as the theory of probabilities, quantum mechanics, and fuzzy logic, and we have Nicholas of Cusa vision of the order of potentia, and Plotinus, and many approaches. But as a holistic discipline that studies the world of potentia, that thinks about possibilization of the world, not only about actualization of possibilities, I think we need to think about this third philosophical major discipline precisely because to be able is irreducible to any of other predicates. And I try to introduce the discipline in my book, A Philosophy of the Possible, published in English in 2019, in Russian, and came out 20 years ago. But I think that the book on the Gordian knot provides a beautiful framework for this new disciplinary breakthrough in the very field of philosophy, and in particular philosophy of science.
Thank you, Mikhail. Potentiology, I love that. Sometimes you need a good name for a new discipline. And
Ontology, epistemology, and potentiology, yes.
Yes. Jude, did you have anything, or should we?
No, I'm really eager to have folks have a chance to chime in. The rest of the folks, Alexei's question is fascinating on agency in the chat. So I would love to jump into that kind of stuff.
Great, yeah. So I think George Lucas had to run to pick up grandchildren, but he had asked this question about possibility or potentiality and probability, which I think Tim, you began to address just a moment ago. But Farzad had a follow-up to that. And maybe since George has left, Farzad, do you want to unmute and sort of frame your question as a follow-up to George's about probability?
Sure. Yeah. So in short, what I said, I can shorten it a bit and just say, what is the relationship between probability and possibility? It seemed George was saying, couldn't probability be more prior? So then replace that in the opposition with actuality, and so that got me to thinking the same thing. Which one comes first? Do they even have that which one comes first relationship, or where do they stand? They use each other somehow, but anyway, that's where I was at with that. So I'm just interested, Tim, what do you think? Where do you put those two to
Yeah.
even
Well,
bother to put them in.
Right. I would argue that the possibility that what I call the landscapes of potentia are prime, because that by pointing to the fundamental order of potentia, to the fundamental order of landscapes of possibility as being ingredient to fundamental quantum process, then I'm saying that in a very fundamental way that is primary, and that the evolution of quantum states itself reinforces that. That is, you have an evolution from the pure state of potential outcome states that can violate the principle of excluded metal, that can be a wide range of possibilities. They're not discrete and required to be within a very small subset of the possible to conform to probable values. That among probable values, they have to the mixed state of probable outcome states in the second part of the quantum evolution need to satisfy the principle of non-contradiction. You can't have something that is, so to speak, contradicting another possibility among the set of probabilities. The probability is they're discrete and they sum up to a total of not more than one in terms of scaling probabilities, right? And then you have the output actualization. So by virtue of the conforming to the description in the physics, the landscapes of potentia are primary, and the constraints of the system to the mixed states of probability that then are constrained to be not more than what most certainly is actualized, then the ultimate actualization. So it's so to speak a combination of epistemic and ontic, but it's not at the level of the what I say, the landscapes of potentia are primal, and then I would say on the complementary side, the fundamental logic of actualization, and then the probability is, so to speak, an intermediate, but secondary.
There was a follow-up that's on this same topic by John Mayer, and I wonder if John, if you want to, let me unmute so that you can frame your question there.
It was just more my own sense that I view probability theory as a tool that's used by scientists and mathematicians and people in finance and economics, technology, and not as a metaphysical notion that's related to potentia in the same way. And so I was curious if so I would agree that it's a secondary or a higher or a more abstract notion in some sense for me than the more primordial notion of potential, which gets you into questions that can't be resolved in terms of simple probability theories or clear probability theories. That you run into issues that are irresolvable in mathematical terms and therefore can't be turned into a probability equation.
I agree entirely. That's well expressed. Thank you very much.
So, Jude, did you want to bring in this Persian?
Oh, I was just throwing that out as a possibility to help us, since Perse is so important to Tim's project. You know, that maybe seeing nature as, in a sense, probabilistic, you know, as opposed to the notion of law, the way the concept of law has connotations that demand necessity.
Yes.
Oh yeah. Oh, you see, what I've done in my book is to suggest that what we call physical laws, quote unquote law, right? Not being God-given hand-me-downs from 18th century deism, etc. Right. But that I think of physical relationship, Schrödinger equation, and so forth, as being constraints on possibility, and that the Feynman's method and other methods for minimization principles are expressions or technical ways to illustrate that by by working with technical ways to express constraints and possibility, you can actually derive the fundamental equations of physics. And to me, that's an indicator of that the landscapes of potentia is a distinct order, complementary to the order of actualization. And that thinking of it that way actually helps you in terms of re-understanding the nature of physical relationships that doesn't depend on, say, well, some kind of the suggestion that there's simply evolutionary habits of the system, that there are constraints and possibility, and those constraints may have habit components over cosmic time, but that's, I think, a secondary question. But I wouldn't first order think of them as, so to speak, habits.
Yeah,
I mean,
that's right.
This is very interesting, and I think just since we're on this topic, Randy Axier has posted a comment that I'd love to have him articulate for us if you'd like. But I'm thinking of Whitehead here, and Tim, what you were just saying reminded me very much of Whitehead's two ultimates, the creativity and God, where in terms of the role of law in the physical universe, there's a need for some constraint on the realm of potential, right? In order for then habit to develop. And in Whitehead's scheme, that's the role of the primordial nature of God, right? To constrain potentia in some sense. And, I wonder if you've thought much about how to link your scheme in with Whitehead's at all. And then if you want to say something about that, otherwise we can turn to Randy and he can articulate his question.
No, I haven't. I haven't thought again about that specific question vis-a-vis Whitehead. I've been focused on to be inspired. Well, I came up with this thought about the constraints on potential being really, a fundamental basis for the emergence of physical law. And a couple of years ago, and then I wrote some material on it, and then I discovered that a Russian philosopher independently put this together and did a doctoral thesis on it a few years ago. We've invited him, and I right now I have a senior moment. I can't remember his name, but he's done excellent work on this very question. So no, I haven't addressed that issue. So there's all kinds of possible follow-ons to my limited efforts. But let's turn over to Randy for his comment.
Yeah, Randy, help us, please.
Well, you were certainly right, Matt, to sense that my my comment was about connecting what Tim's doing to Whitehead. I mean, of course, we'll all remember that he makes the distinction between general potentiality and real potentiality in the extensive continuum section. And so his vocabulary can sometimes lead us to sort of miss what he's talking about. But general potentiality is possibility seen from the standpoint of actuality, and that's actuality not abstracted. So the method of coordinate analysis, which, by the way, people seem to have a very hard time understanding it, even though it's relatively simple, if you ask me. I mean, we all learned how to put things on X, Y, and Z axes somewhere along the line. I don't know about you, but I had to do that in high school. Coordinate analysis means that, you define your X's, your Y's, your Z's according to the demands of your inquiry, whatever it may be. And in the case of Whitehead, we've got 8 categories of existence. That's the X-axis. We've got 9 categories of explanation. That's the Y-axis. We got 27 categorical obligations. That's the Z-axis. And it does not require that we actually divide what can't be divided. It's more a matter of locating the dynamics of the movement, that when you make a change here, you make a change there. And process and reality gives us 3 analyses of these X, Y, and Z axes: a theory of the extensive continuum, a theory of perception, a theory of prehension. And then these are brought together in a theory of extensive connection in part 4. And this is the structure of the book is not that complicated, but the logic of the book is it's inventive, it's new. It is based on not so much directly, but it's easy to apply Peirce's logic to what Whitehead is doing. But it really comes from Kant's logic and the three divisions. One of the things we have a hard time in the present, a lot of people don't know the history of logic. And so they think that logic just means, whatever Principia Mathematica started, when in fact, in Whitehead today, logic was a much broader question about the norms of thinking more than anything else. How ought you to tackle a problem, and how ought you to formalize a problem in order to tackle it? And coordinate analysis, the primary method of process and reality, is not some kind of monotonic propositional logic. That's not the logic that's involved. It's an older logic, and it's really set out by Kant, and it's pursued by many people in the 19th century, but not so many people in the 20th. And so you have to have these divisions of assertoric, problematic, and hypothetical in order to understand how Whitehead is doing what he's doing. And so I put in the comment, basically, this is just Kant. I mean, it's just straightforward Kant logic, and in fact, that's the logic of process and reality. Whitehead didn't invent this; he just adapted it to his inquiry. And so, in this case, the question of probability is not a difficult question at all. It's one of the subcategories of how the actual affects other actual. And you guys are using the word potency for that, and that's okay because Whitehead calls it real potentiality. That it's the same thing. But general potentiality is different. You can't ever get entirely away from actuality, but you can abstract actuality in order to look at the other axes. This is what he says in the first few pages of Part 4. So anyway, sorry, I talked too much. But
well, I must say that I'm a little, I'm not strong in philosophy, but in particular Kant. I'm a little weak on Kant, and I would love to read, say, I enjoyed your recent work, and I would like more of how to understand the connection of what I've done with Kant and Whitehead. That would be very helpful. Mind you, what I've done is, so to speak, quite independent of what you're describing and some great philosophic nuance. So that's wonderful.
Yeah, sure, but it works. I don't see. I mean, I'm going to talk next time in July. So, but I don't see any serious problem with what you've done in your book relative to this other stuff. So it can be connected to Whitehead in a more intimate way, but it's like John Cobb said at the beginning of this, in some ways, connecting it to Whitehead might not be the absolute best idea, because sort of moving forward might be a better idea. It's just my opinion.
Interesting. Thank you, Randy, and definitely look forward to digging into this next month. So now that we've solved the potentiality, probability, possibility problem, we can move on. Let's see, I think Rick Doherty has a question about time, referencing Lee Smolin, the cosmologist. Rick, are you still with us?
Yes. Mm-hmm.
Great. Go ahead and frame your question for us.
Well, the theory of relativity by Einstein eliminates time. That is, there's no directionality in terms of relativity theory. Smolin disagrees with this and has written a new book called Time Reborn, emphasizing that time is essential. And I've only read the first third of it, but he proclaims to prove that the theory of relativity is wrong in eliminating time, that time is critical. And I'm wondering how your commentators deal with the concept of time in terms of what they're talking about.
I think, go ahead, Tim. Yeah.
So yes, that's interesting. There's a section of my book where I discuss the debate of Bergson and Einstein in 1922. There were a series of debates, and they struggled with this question. And Einstein at that time proclaimed, well, in the physics, there's no such thing as time. It's just, that's a fiction, right? We don't need reference to that, except as a marker of time-space correlation. So to speak, if you focus just on the order of actualization and measurement outputs, say in a laboratory experiment, and then you focus on the sets of variables and their discrete outcomes, the data, and you're correlating those outcomes, that data, then those correlations and the basic science with it then will exhibit all the features of relativistic limitation and Einstein's special theory of relativity and so forth. And one could be led by virtue of that success into supposing that we have the whole shebang there, that we fundamentally understand the nature of the world. And oh yeah, but there's some distortions by virtue of introducing general relativity theory. Then you have the space-time elements that then have being shaped and whatever. But in the conceptuality I'm bringing to the table, there is a fundamental distinction between the order of actualization and the order of landscapes of potentia, and that time space and the time space metrics are derivative relative to the fundamental notions of process, logic, and relations. And by introducing that kind of philosophic notion, the presupposition, so to speak, of relativity theory, that at that level, then if you think of the metric associations of time, space-time as being derivative relative to that, then you can have both Einstein being right in a sense, that is, my correlations exhibit these features of special relativity and their relativistic limitations, and Bergson's right by virtue of pointing to possibilization and what Mikhail Epstein has pointed out about that in the most fundamental nature of the world is, again, this the possibilist realm that is complementary, that is coextensive. So we need not reduce it to nothing but space-time description. And further, one could argue that the fundamental quantum field theory that one can derive from extensiveness, process, logic, and relations can derive the space-time metrics and that kind of description. So instead of presupposing that that's a fundamental level, which Einstein does, that there may be new approaches to seeing it as a derivative level, which has been done by a few recent theorists, as I referenced in the book.
Yeah. And I mean, a question I have about Lee Smolin's work is the extent to which, I mean, he does often reference Whitehead, but only in passing. And I wonder to what extent Smolin is distinguishing between time and process, as Whitehead did and as you do, Tim, where there's something more fundamental than metrical time and metrical space that maybe we can say is time-like, but it's not something we measure with clocks. And I don't know that when Lee Smolin says that time is fundamental, that he's making that distinction.
Yeah, insofar as I've read Smolin, I'm not sure he's very clear about that distinction. And he does not bring up, so far as I know, this issue of the distinction of the logic of actuals and the logic of landscapes of potentia in the way that I do based upon basic quantum physics. He indirectly does, but anyway, I'm not sure. You know, it's typical of essentially everybody working with the issue of philosophy of relativity theory to presuppose actualism, presuppose that the logic of actuality is the foundational one, and that space-time description in terms of space-time metric is foundational. I'm calling a question to both of those, for both scientific and philosophic reasons.
All right. On this issue of Einstein, Jude, you mentioned in the chat that you wanted to speak to Einstein's relationship to Spinoza. Did you want to?
No, not that I wanted to speak. I just I've heard in that exchange a possibility of defending the way that Einstein embraces Spinoza, in terms of whatever he had encountered. He wrote that delightful poem about Spinoza, and there's a that appeal to the Spinozistic God in what seems to be the interstices of his thinking appeals to me. So I'm interested in something that can defend it while also having Bergson be held to be right as well. So I was just observing that. I'm intrigued, not that I had anything particularly insightful to add.
Well, I think there's two sides to Einstein. I think the 1922 Einstein in debate with Bergson was the one that was focused just a presupposed actualism, and that we don't need time directly in that, and we can talk about the space-time metrics and all that in a very, say, discrete input-output format, and without reference to what I refer to as the logical order of potentia. There's the other Einstein, but you see, this order of actualization is a radically pluralistic order. It's contemporary naturalism. That is, that the world is nothing but a multitudinous of separate discrete things, atoms and substances and their correlations and all that. And that description, that scientific description, is adequate to all kinds of description. And without limit, one could argue. Well, that's maybe a contemporary naturalism. I would say that is incomplete necessarily. That assumes a Boolean logical description as being ultimate, and that's simply wrong. That the fundamental logic is both the Boolean and the non-Boolean, both the logic of actualization and the landscapes of potentia. If we accept that kind of notion, which I think is ingredient to the quantum theory, and some of these new results in, as we'll discuss more in the next session next month in detail, that radical pluralistic understanding of the world is not the ultimate description. That in combination with it is a radical unity that's embedded in the logical order of landscapes of potential. There is a unitary description in the quantum physics. There's a unity to that, so to speak. It's like a certain part whole contrast. The discreteness, the contingency of the world as given to us in all these particular actualizations, and then the unity of the realms of possibility, the radical unlimitedness of the possibilities, and yet the unity with respect to their primal logical foundation. So to me, that's Spinoza. That's the Spinozistic side of Einstein. And then he had an intuition for that, an intuition for a grounding for ethics by that. And then that grounding of ethics comes out in Einstein in speaking out about the threat of nuclear weapons in his letter in the early 1940s, et cetera. So Einstein has both. It's just that he was only representing one in 1922.
Yeah, thank you for that additional context with Einstein. So many great questions here. I hope we can get to most of them at least. Let's go to Wolfgang Leidhold. I think you are here. Did you want to frame your question about the nature of experience as Tim is using it?
Yeah, thank you. I'm joining you here from Cologne, and in some respect from far outside of your discourse. Since I'm coming from a different background, so one of my teachers was Eric Voegelin, who spent the last years of his life in Stanford. And in the meantime, I have developed my own sort of approach. But I started out reading Whitehead quite a bit, so maybe there's a link between what you're up to and I'm up to. And since I have heard you mention in the initial parts of your short presentation the term experience, I was just wondering, it's just a matter of conceptual clearance. Do you always equate experience with what we would call sensory perception? Or are there many more forms of experience? Like for me, I would say imagination is a separate one. And you mentioned spiritual experience for yourself as well. Is that a unit of sensory experience, or is that not a question that resonates with you? I'm just curious.
Oh yes, well, that question definitely resonates with me, and I learned from my mentor and teacher David Griffin on some of these issues that impact a multitude of issues. Dr. Griffin was referred to the orientation only to the senses can lead to a philosophic position of sensationalism, a philosophic claim that somehow is the all and entirety of what experience can be could be a mapping to nothing but discrete inputs, outputs associated with the senses, and that would be sensationalism. Well, I disagree with all, so to speak, isms, and including that one. And if you imagine that there is inevitably, as Mikhail has pointed out, this possibilistic, imaginative tapping into the landscapes of potentia in multiple ways, that's part of our experience, broadly understood, and clearly is not reducible to sensa. And there are, one perhaps could imagine other forms of experience broadly understood that has that goes beyond sensationalism. So yes, I agree entirely. And I'm just hoping that in my work I've helped to articulate maybe a more explicit reason why sensationalism is false.
Well, you know, the link between what you are saying here. Can you hear me?
Mm-hmm.
Yes.
Yes.
Yeah.
Thank you.
And your interpretation or your comments to Whitehead is that I define the term experience with a key concept of participation. So the way we get in touch with reality, which is a sort of a reificated way of philosophical speech, I wanted to clarify, and I think relationships and participation are making up what I call the structure of experience. So experience and reality are ultimately related. And so what interests me mainly is what kind of participations make up our various form of experience. Does that resonate with you as well? So to talk about the different ways of participation, one of which might be imagination, another might be a sense of order, another one might be consciousness in itself.
Mm-hmm. Yeah. So yeah, you're calling us to extend our notion of experience in a very broad way, and I agree with that. And Mikhail, I think, is also expressing that. Yes, very good. The fundamental notions I had brought out were process, logic, relations, and extensiveness as the most fundamental notions, and that even time and space and the usual marking off, the outcomes of experiments, whatever is being derivative relative to that. But relations is one of the fundamental notions. And yes, I think, and the relations are always a form of input-output context, always a fundamental triadicity, never just simply dyadic. And that our subject-object descriptions or input-output descriptions are always some approximation to that. So taking that as, so to speak, insight from this, what I take good methodology in the sciences, and philosophically extending that, yeah, I would say that, so to speak, part of that context is imagination and possibilism in the way that Mikhail brought out. Yes, I mean, it's like you're on the right track from my view.
This reminds me of something Whitehead says in his little book, The Function of Reason, where he talks about the tendency of the sciences to look to its own abstract models of the base of reality, or what it supposes to be the base of reality, particles or what have you, and build up from there to the more complex forms of nature, such as ourselves. And Whitehead says, well, okay, but maybe we can reverse this too, and beginning with our own experience, sort of with a method of abstraction, seeing how far down we can push the analogy into nature of our own sense of what he would call bodily reception or causal efficacy, right? This relationship between potentiality and actuality that we feel. Maybe our own experience, in a sense, gives us a window into this non-Boolean domain or field of potentia in the natural world. And so he wants to reverse the order of explanation, in a sense.
Right.
Yeah.
Thank you, Wolfgang, for that contribution. Very interesting area to delve into. Let's turn now. I want to apologize also for not taking a break earlier. I totally forgot because I was so wrapped up in the dialogue. So if you need to use the restroom, we've got 5 more minutes left, and then we will end on time. But I do apologize for not inserting a break halfway through. I'll be sure to do that in our future sessions. Let's
I'll take with myself, but of course others could continue to chat during this time.
Yeah. Alexi, are you still with us? Did you want to ask your question? I think it was for Jude.
So I would like to continue the line of Jude. So she talked about this propagating knots in nature, and I would like to personalize them somehow and call them semiotic agency. So this is the topic of the interdisciplinary science of biosemiotics, which integrates biology and the theory of signification. So signification is not simply input-output relation, it's much more complex. So, and that's why I'm not so fond of the notion of input. Input is a sign, actually, so for agency. The main input is sign. And the output is not a mechanical output, but it is a construction of meaning, which is completely different thing. And the context is very important in this respect as well. So in addition to these 3 items, input, output, and context, it's very important to add agency. And the agency is very complex because it is hierarchical, and higher level agents make lower level sub-agents to perform specific tasks. And this is the topic that is intrinsically biological. So I'm a biologist in this company, in contrast to most physicists here and philosophers. So it's very important to bring biologists into discussion here and to talk about evolution, because evolution is how meanings emerge in evolution. And organisms are actually, they are generators of possibilities. So here we talk about possibilities, but we need to look at the agency that generates these possibilities, that stays behind this active creation of possibilities. And it's not only the mechanisms that are developed by agents, like sub-agents. For example, a cell creates ribosome to synthesize protein, but also cells develop strategies for future production and future kinds of construction. So it's evolvability. So it's the potential to create more diverse and more complicated meaning. So this is a very complex, large area. So I cannot cover it with my short note, but if you are interested, we can continue discussion on that.
I think it's really, really important. So I was glad we turned to your question right there, because I think it weaves onto the prior conversation about, why the flaw in scientism is, Matt reminded us of something from The Function of Reason, but I found my mind going to the earlier things that led Whitehead to metaphysics in the first place, which is the idea that the scientistic model explained nothing. It described regularities, but it didn't explain how regularities occur in an arising of events. And so he turned to what I see as a thoroughly agentive metaphysics, right? Not in any simplistic way, but that agency in nature seems to be an essential feature of it, getting rid of, the heavy consciousness and ethical overtones of agency, but that there's a doing, right? The category of the ultimate is the category of the ultimate for a reason. Something is being made. Yes. And if not to be made is to not just happen, right? It's being created by, in my view, the entire provocative flux of the universe. It's a doing, something that's done.
Right, and Whitehead actually talked about temporal thickness. It was one of his important concepts, and that is directly related to the notion of agency. So agency brings past experience and applies it to reaching future goals and future strategies. So that's why the time becomes thick. So it may be millions of years are brought into one action.
Right.
Yeah, very, very interesting. There's agency all the way down, and there's some value being realized by this agency, right?
That's
which
right.
is which is what the normal scientific approach, the way of numbers, as Tim frames it, leaves out, which is why we need these other domains.
Yeah, so all science is persistently putting agency away. So they do not speak about agency. So the physicists, for example, physics do not place the physicist into the picture. The physicist is always somewhere away and taken out of brackets. The same thing with psychologists. So they put the consciousness and mind away. So they only speak about associations or logic. They speak about ontology, but not of the person who creates that ontology, because each person has its own ontology. And that was developed by Jacob von Uexküll, who was talking about umbel theory. So this is a very complex area.
Wow, yeah. One more line from the Function of Reason comes to mind, where Whitehead says that scientists animated by the purpose of proving that they are purposeless constitute an interesting subject for study.
I quote that at least once a month.
Yeah. So we've reached the top of the hour here, and our 2 hours together are coming to completion. I know there were some more questions. I think we're off to a really, really great start here. Yep, there's Tim. He's back. Go ahead.
I may just respond. So yes, I agree with that comment about agency and the so to a wide range of systems. Yeah, with agency as a part of that input output context triadic, quadratic, whatever, with Jude's insightful note or comment on that, by all means. A key person that inspired me for the basic quantum argument that'll come up in the second session is Hans Primus, a quantum chemist. And he passed away around 2012, but Harold Ottmanspacher picked up some of his materials and helped to complete his last book, Knowledge and Time. And here it is. And I found out about it like 4 years ago, and then cracked it open, and the most insightful chapters are his first two chapters on the Boolean and the non-Boolean and all that discussion. And like it was like, wow, it just blew me away. Then realized the connection with the other two approaches I've been working with that I've already mentioned, and then how it all ties together. But then Primus explicitly talks about the way in which the standard scientific description fails to incorporate the fact of the experimenter, the fact of the person setting up the context and making the decisions and so forth, and that a scientism and a scientific description inevitably cannot be complete. And so he articulates that in a wonderful way that I quote in my book. So yes, agency. Now, of course, on the question about it's the potential for agency is all the way down, but actually where it emerges at a certain level, that's sort of a matter of actual, say, test and experimentation. I wouldn't say, as a panpsychist might, that it's all the way down, whatever, it's in a simplistic way, but certainly the potential is there over the full range.
Great. Thank you, Tim. I think we better bring this to a close for today. And I think we've certainly primed the engine for the remaining 7 sessions. The next one is in July. What is the exact date? Second Saturday in July, which is July 10th, 8 a.m. Pacific, 11 a.m. Eastern. We hope you can all join us again. We will have more great respondents. Tim will share more. And yeah, we're off and running. So Jude, Mikhail, thank you so much for your contributions.
Thank you.
Thanks to all the great for the great questions from the rest of our audience. Yeah, what a pleasure to explore these ideas with you.